This is a Requiem Metal Podcast, Episode 10, Anathema.
Welcome to episode 10 of the Requiem Metal Podcast. I'm your host, Jason Hundy.
And I'm Mark Rudolph, and tonight we're going to continue some more British doom and gloom with Anathema.
Yeah, and last week, those of you listening, hopefully, most of you who are listening right now, heard us do kind of a strange approach at Paradise Lost, not necessarily a career retrospective or historical type thing, but more of a kind of looking at some of our favorite tunes. This time we're going to kind of do a little of both. Kind of a career retrospective of the early era, kind of the original lineup era, as we like to call it, looking at their first four records, and first four records including kind of a full-length EP called Pentacost III that we'll sort of take a look at as well. What are your experiences early on with Anathema? Because you guys, obviously, you and Chris kind of probably came into them way before I did. So
yeah, there's kind of, I believe, again talked with Chris to double check some facts, and from the best of his recollection, I think it was an EP, or he got a 7-inch EP, and then we were in, I couldn't even tell you which one it was. I think it was whatever they did, pre-Serenades, there's something that came out. I don't think it was it's not the Crestfallen that came out post.
No, it's, I'm trying to remember. There was some of the songs showed up on the Resonance CDs that Peaceful put out a few years back, which was sort of a collection of their Peaceful years.
Okay.
And a couple of their songs from those demos or 7 inches came out. It escapes me for the life of me. We'll have to.
And I think Chris got like an original promo copy of Serenades as well, like the one that was actually reissued in 03. In 03, Peaceful put it out back in the original format that it originally came out in.
Gotcha. Because the version I had, which is, we're talking about the first Anathema record, first full length called Serenades, also came with an additional EP called the Crestfallen EP, which was kind of recorded near the same time, but it was
like a 7-inch plus a couple other random things thrown on.
Yeah, and it was a little bit of an evolution for the band.
Figure out.
So, but Anathema is again one of the Peaceful Three, as I like to call it, with My Dying Bride and Paradise Lost, who you heard last week, and they're a very unique mixture of certainly Celtic Frost elements, and then some more traditional doom elements. I hear some Candlemass in there. Obviously, it's not so much the stoner kind of Sabbath doom type sound, but it's more this the European sensibilities of doom that like Celtic Frost and
doom kind of stuff.
Yeah, very, very apocalyptic, especially in those early records, before they started to add the Pink Floyd psychedelic elements and atmospherics that will kind of start to creep into their music a little bit later. We almost referred to some of the Anathema stuff. It's so repetitious at times and atmospheric, and it lacks a lot of structure at moments.
Yeah,
and
it's
it
very freeform.
Yeah, and it almost requires your total sort of attention, and we refer to it as like tantric doom or something. At least in the early stages. Years later, their later albums become a more sort of traditional rock format in some ways. But
a lot of the players, we've got John Douglas on drums, who's doing a lot of very unmetal type things. Like on the surface it might sound like it, but he's doing these little odd off-time triplets in the background, or just like really weird fill drum choices, and
he's kind of playing against time sometimes, off beat with a lot of things,
just behind the beat, ahead of the beat. At first sometimes it seems a little bit off, but it seems they kind of the music kind of like surges, where it'll be all kind of cacophonous at 1 minute, and then it'll kind of like gel and just keep like plodding on forward.
And I always felt like they almost wanted everything to always be off. They didn't look at, like, Paradise Lost, I feel like was writing through the scope of sort of traditional like rock and roll songs. My Dying Bride was going for sort of epic, almost like classical songs with
stuff,
movements and things. And Anathema was it was like they were totally influenced by the whole sort of psychedelic LSD sort of free form kind of anti-song structure that you see with a lot of the late 60s Pink Floyd kind of stuff, and that was like creeping into their music in some ways.
Yeah, I'm really kind of curious. It's weird that all, Bride, Paradise Lost, and Anathema all started at the same time, relatively on the same path, but like completely all veered different ways.
Yeah, and yet they're tied together in some ways.
Yeah.
Like you play, generally if you like one, you usually like all three, is what I've sort of come to found. Very often does someone be a really big My Dying Bride fan, is like, oh, I hate Anathema and Paradise Lost.
It doesn't make sense.
Yeah, it doesn't make any sense. Yeah, so it is kind of interesting how kind of where they came from in terms of their origins. And when we talk about the original lineup, you mentioned John Douglas, who, again, is a fantastic drummer. And it's kind of interesting to point out that the record store that Mark and I used to work at was managed by Mike Johnston, who's a member of the Northwoods Improvisers. Great sort of improvisational jazz band. He certainly knows a lot about music, teaches a lot of music history classes at the college level. And I remember him really being tuned into Anathema. I think almost out of all the metal type stuff that we played in the store, he always told me Anathema was his favorite.
He mentioned like how he could appreciate aspects of Opeth, but Anathema always seemed to be just a little bit like with Danny Kavanagh's playing. He's not playing like how Gregor McIntosh was playing with the guitarist from Paradise Lost we were talking about last episode. How he'd play these kind of single string drawn out leads with very few notes, but really kind of he'd make the most out of a little. And Danny's doing something very similar to that, but he's like holding out notes and using not necessarily being notes, but feedback, bends, and he's doing some unbelievable stuff that's not at all traditional guitar playing, really, for a lead. I
would call Danny Kavanaugh one of the two Kavanaugh brothers that sort of makes up the core of Anathema, but he's the lead guitar player essentially for Anathema. I'd say he's really the master of feedback. I don't know if I've ever heard another guitar player in any genre really just sort of play with it
use
that much.
As an element throughout. As like it's like a lead almost throughout the song instead of actually like strumming notes. It's just like bending stuff and feedback and pinch harmonics and scraping the string. All kinds of really almost like in the Immortal episode I were talking about people using their inabilities to play as like strengths. I don't know if that's his case or not, but it sounds like he really just screwed around. Like maybe he had a guitar that had horrible grounding or something that got bad feedback, and he learned how to work with that. Sure. Or something. But it's a really interesting technique.
And it's almost very contrary to the kind of feedback maybe some of you are used to. It's not like Stooges MC5 or grunge feedback where it's like piercing because they blew the crap out of their speakers and they're breaking the instruments as they're playing. Like the Mudhoney kind of sound or something. It's a totally...
I Hate God feedback.
Yeah, where like every song screeches at you. And it just, again, it sort of creates this lush atmosphere that's these almost like waves sort of, floating throughout the music. And it's a totally unique sound. And even with their early stuff on Serenades, which also kind of had these just ultra sort of slow, heavy, almost
similar
like kind of
the Paradise Lost, the chunking, the typical muted metal riff. But they do it like it's so layered and it's almost like stuff falling on you nonstop. You can't get out of. Waves
it's like you're drowning almost. Quicksand kind of sound. But it's really interesting. And then of course, the more Pink Floydisms that start to come into their music, I think, is almost the perfect palette for him to paint on with his guitar, because of the fact that it's so free and limitless that he can do all these sort of feedback type things, and it's interesting because they will go. I don't want to like give the impression that they elude song structure, because they do have song structures and there's verse and choruses and stuff.
But they usually have like a theme, a very small, like a 5-6 note, compilation of notes that they use throughout the song. But it's like they do a lot of things like they do in jazz where they allude to the theme in the beginning, like they'll play the first 3 notes and then kind of draw it out and then just keep building and building. They're really, really good musicians, or really good songwriters.
Sure. And you hear that, and we'll talk about it later when we get to Silent Enigma, but especially Dying Wish is just built around this like theme, but they draw it out for 8 minutes just like jazz can do, and not one part of any of that song sounds like repetitious or boring at all. And I mean, there aren't very many songwriters that can write an 8-minute long sort of metal song with very few lyrics that doesn't kind of crumble at a certain point.
Yeah, and it's not just like riff after riff after riff after riff.
It's not proggy,
like
it's not opeth or anything where it's movements or anything. It's one continuous, like you said, theme that's sort of established.
Not the stop-start staccato stuff.
Yeah, and that was even hard. That's a way different than I would say Paradise Lost. I mean, Paradise Lost, not that they were like opeth, but like in their longer songs, like Daylight Torn, I think was the name of the one song. It was like 7.5 minutes. There was a lot of different movements and some stop-starts.
They slow down and go to an acoustic passage or something. Yeah. But Anathema could just kind of keep it constantly kind of flowing through the whole song, which is very unique.
Yeah, and you'll hear them start to flirt with that on their very first record, which is Serenades, which we'll get into talking about in just a second. But before we do that, I do want to mention that the two brothers that really kind of make up the band are Danny Cavanaugh, the guitar player we've been talking about, and then Vincent Cavanaugh, who originally started off as the rhythm guitar player, and then the original vocalist was
Darren White.
Darren White,
who went on to he was in Blood Divine, put out 2 records with. I can't even think of Paul something or other. He's the guitarist for Cradle of Filth. Paul Alexander, I think is
one of the original guys there. And then now he's a cartographer, you said, right?
Yeah, that's what me and Chris are talking. When I mentioned Chris Dick again, he was a collaborator of mine in the past where we worked on fanzines together, and he'll eventually be on the show.
he's like the guy who writes all the songs for Elton John, but it never appears. He's like the Bernie Taupin of our kind of talk Requiem podcast here. But yeah, so, and then John Douglas, who you already mentioned, and then someone we really have to give props to, because as we've been kind of like going back and listening to a lot of these older Anathema records, the bass chops are just extraordinary.
Fantastic.
And that's Duncan Patterson. And if I'm not mistaken, Duncan Patterson went on to form that one band. They put a couple records out on Peaceville, and they were very real atmospheric kind of stuff. I can just totally...
It was like Enigma or something?
Antimatter.
Okay.
Yeah. Okay. And again, I'm sorry to bring that up on the fly as we're recording live, because it suddenly came into my head, and I was like, oh yeah, what was that band he was in? But he's just a really interesting musician, And
another interesting thing about the bass playing, it's not distorted.
Yeah, it's very
clean. Actually comes through, and it really propels the songs along and lets Danny kind of stand back and just kind of mess around with the atmosphere of that feedback, and not necessarily be such a riff master,
Sure, it almost has... It's almost like if Hetfield and Hammett were a lot more like laid back on those early Metallica records, and you would have, he's very Cliff Burton-y, in a way that he's sort of leading with the bass, but
he's not flashy, but
he's not Steve Harris. He's not like playing bass leads, but he's you can definitely be aware.
It's similar to jazz bass, where that's kind of like the glue that everybody else kind of dances around, but then he can still, keep everything going and keep everything fresh and interesting as well.
Sure, and we've had quite a few experiences of getting to meet these guys before, and I've interviewed them a couple times for Eclipse magazine, which was the magazine that we did kind of after the Requiem kind of folded a few years later. And the thing that I remember the most from talking to Vincent, who I kind of became pretty good friends with, was some of his other musical influences outside of like the assumed metal influences and and Pink Floyd influences. He's very fascinated by Radiohead, which of course the way that they kind of compose songs is obviously fairly abstract and really has attracted a lot of sort of music people, not necessarily just average fans, but really people understand music and recording. He was also really, really influenced by Jeff Buckley, and Jeff Buckley's approach to songwriting was sort of jazz-ish in a way.
And Buckley came from like some like hard rock / metal acts beforehand, but I don't know of any male vocalists, or a lot of female vocalists as well, that don't credit Buckley to some degree. He was, I think, one of the best vocalists of the last 50 years. Sure,
without a doubt. And of course, his dad's choice, folk music, which he even said like at times he tried not to be influenced by, but I'm sure it kind of fed into degree. Him. Was very, there was a lot of jazz playing, kind of bass playing and things. It was just, again, the influences that Anathema were taking, that Vincent would talk about at the drive-in, for instance, were completely left field kind of bands. He was not talking about, he would talk about Bjork and just, things like really, really sort of strange influences. And I think that really filters into their music. That you'll hear somewhat in some of these songs, but certainly years later, I think if we were to do a second era of Anathema, you'd probably hear a lot more of the Buckleyisms. It won't be as obvious here, you know,
especially on Judgment and Find Day to Exit. And I mean, there's a lot of it.
Yeah, and so. But anyways, that's the original lineup, and one guy who will play on a couple of the records when they get a little bit more keyboard heavy is Les Smith, who is he still currently in Cradle of Filth?
No, he's purely on Anathema now because Martin, can't think of the old violin player for
My Dying
Bride is the new keyboard player.
I know
Cradle of Filth's a catch-all for every other extreme
exactly.
band. So.
And it's funny because Anathema kept losing members, so it's Cradle of Filth. They lose years later Dave Pybus and some other guys.
It's the kind of the constant thing that Anathema's never been able to really find a genre to call their own, or their fan base is pretty dedicated, but it's a matter of getting out there to new people. You know, if you're gonna, it's either Anathema or Cradle of Filth. If you look at the money Cradle of Filth's pulling, and I can see why you might go that way for
career longevity.
Sure, sure.
But it's been one of the hard things, and one of the things is as I've grown in appreciation, because I think for you, Paradise Lost is sort of your band of this sort of scene, and for me, I think it would probably be Anathema in both eras, this early stuff that we'll hear today, and then the later stuff. So hopefully, if you do like some of this early stuff, and especially where it starts to go on the last couple sets of music that we play, you'll check out some of the later stuff, and we'll talk about all that later.
And even the earlier the stuff off Serenades, I think that Blood Divine's basically like kind of a refined version of Serenades.
Sure.
And Darren White's got a very unique, to say the least, voice, very kind of bellowy, and it's odd to describe. He's not like a traditionally like talented vocalist, but he's got a lot of power, and he's got really interesting techniques, so he kind of works with his limitations, I think.
Yeah, and there aren't many bands that sort of, whereas like last week when we talked about Paradise Lost, we talked about how Catatonia, and there's some bands that sort of take direct influence from Paradise Lost. Really, the only band we could openly hear that sort of draws from this early era of Anathema would be Primordial, which is a really cool, interesting Irish band.
And I think, did that come out in 95? I'm thinking they came out toward the mid 90s, I think.
Yeah, they definitely were.
But you can definitely hear that. Even in some of the early Anathema stuff, it's almost got that traditional Irish folk, like a riffing style or something, if you call it that. But that you can definitely tell it's got like some kind of like folk or traditional elements going on with the riffing.
Oh yeah, it's definitely there, and you'll hear it especially in the one acoustic song that we'll play off of Serenades, the French song, which I won't butcher at the moment. But speaking of Serenades, this is the first or second record I ever heard from these guys. I think I picked up Eternity because it came out when I was in high school, and I was making mention to Mark that I have some sort of very deep memories attached to that record. But I think I picked up Eternity, and then I went back, and either Chris or I think maybe Chris lent me the record, and I taped it and listened to that on tape for a while before I eventually bought it on CD. But it was definitely a stark difference from where they end up because of the long epic songwriting, the sort of repetitious sort of like just pummeling kind of riffing. And fortunately for you, the listener, we're not going to play the long kind of punishing songs. We had flirted with the idea of possibly playing Lovelorn Rhapsody or Under a Veil of Black Lace or They Will Always Die, which are sort of these 7-8 minute long kind of like just plotting, really kind of grab you and pull you into the quicksand kind of songs.
See, my background of these guys goes with, I picked up Serenades. Everybody was kind of going gaga over that thing. I had a roommate of mine that used to play the thing before he went to sleep like every night, which is, I don't know about you, but I can't fall asleep listening to music like that.
Yeah, it takes you into a nightmarish sort of room.
And then after Pentacost III came out and Darren left, I was kind of done with the band just because I couldn't imagine anybody else doing what they were doing without him attached. So I had like in the 97, 98 had my metal hiatus where I wasn't really following the scene as much as I used to, and I came back on Alternative 4,
which is a record we won't look at today, but
I basically missed out on Silent Enigma and Eternity completely for years. So I've kind of gone back and reappreciated those again, but it's
an interesting link to miss, because there's so much that happened on those two records that really opened them up to a new audience.
Yeah, in a way it was weird to hear like, wow, okay, I heard Pentacost 3, and then I hear Alternative 4. I'm like, where's so you got to kind of do a little bit of detective work to figure out what's going on. But.
Absolutely. But with Serenades, it's a great record, and it's got, like I said, a lot of subtle bass work kind of going in it, especially in the songs that we're going to hear. We're going to be listening to Sweet Tears and Sleepless, and Sweet Tears in particular really kind of introduces a different element that you don't hear on a lot of this record, which is the sort of clean vocal breakdown that they have near the end of the song, and it's one of the few places that you hear it in the song. And then Sleepless, which some people have maybe had brief encounters with Anathema will be pretty familiar with that song, because it's sort of the trademark kind of early Anathema tune.
And a couple years ago, Cradle of Filth covered it, which is kind of interesting. But
yeah, considering half the members were probably originally from Anathema and Cradle of Filth. But
I guess Sleepless almost has like kind of a Cure Disintegration-ish vibe to some degree. It's got a little bit of a goth feel to it, but
it's epic. It's almost like a catchy. It's like their single almost off this record.
Yeah,
it would be the only way of describing it.
But the weird thing, it stands out so much because it doesn't sound like anything else on the record.
Yeah, and that's I think why people like grabbed onto it. And I think Anathema was probably smart enough to know that let's take this as the blueprint for the future of where our songwriting's maybe gonna go. So, but yeah, we're gonna bring a trio of tunes from Serenade, their debut record, Sweet Tears, as I mentioned, Sleepless, and then a very interesting song, which I won't say much about right now, called J'ai fait une promesse. It's French, I think, so enjoy.
those not here, but still they are so dear. I still remember a memory when I weep in my broken sleep. The scars they cut so deep, cut so deep. It's my burden. This is my there will be no loss. There's no mourning, no grief, no pain, no misery, no sleepless nights, missing the dead no more.
Welcome back to the Requiem Metal Podcast, and I think we should also say that if you have any comments or questions or things like that about this episode or any episode that you've heard, please email us at requiempodcast@gmail.org or .com. Sorry. That's requiempodcast@gmail.com. So you just heard a trio of songs, including the two we kind of already talked about. And then the last tune we heard there was the French song, which was very different than what you had heard previously with the female vocals and stuff. So
yeah, the entire, I mean, the whole album in a whole is really kind of hard to pit. It doesn't necessarily fit a genre. It's really kind of playful with its with its use of this stuff. But that was like probably one of the first uses of female vocals where they had a really proficient vocalist that was orchestrated well. It wasn't thrown in there just for, like, Paradise Lost did a little bit of that just to kind of, toy with atmosphere or something. But I think this really kind of nailed it better. Is a better use for it. I always felt. And a lot of people I've known that aren't metal fans really kind of dig on that song as well.
It's definitely a gateway song for a lot of people, and I think that the female vocalist was named Ruth, and I don't think they ever put her last name. Yeah, kind of mysterious, and she appears again on the Crestfallen EP, which is the next thing that Anathema put out after Serenades. But I think what was interesting for me as a younger sort of metal fan, because I'm a few years younger than Mark, so I came into all this stuff late, is songs like that really led to my ability to link on and find something really different between the European scene and the American scene. Mm-hmm. You weren't going to hear anything like that on a Death record or a Morbid Angel record, which was okay. I mean, that's fine. Yeah. They are what they are. But there was something, I guess, more older, cultural. There was roots in history. You almost heard like this history inside the songs, and maybe it's like the minstrel sort of medieval elements of some of the the folkier songs that like a band like In Flames would later do. Yeah. But adding that female vocals in there, especially well done female vocals, adds a touch of class, I think, to the band, and it really kind of raises the level of sort of brevity that's going on. I mean, it makes it more powerful. It also really narrows their fan base, because I knew a lot of people back in the day that thought Anathema was unlistenable. Really? Just because, but like that kind of stuff is like, it's fruity because they've got this going on, and then the songs aren't catchy. I'm like, well, you haven't listened to them then. Yeah. It takes a while to get there, but they really kind of hit hard. Yep. And I think this is something that you're going to see. This album came out in '92. And you're going to see where this opens up a whole new avenue for European metal. Mm-hmm. And quickly on the heels of this, you're going to see The Gathering and Lacuna Coil and In Flames will use female vocals, and even now Opeth and Dark Tranquillity did such an amazing job on Skydancer with them. And it really, I don't know if Anathema were the first. I think Paradise Lost obviously were one of the first to do a good job of it. Beyond Frost, yeah. Yeah, and I mean, Celtic Frost is always first in most things. But, there had been kind of a gap between when Celtic Frost did it in '87 with Into the Pandemonium, and by they were coming out with alongside of Creator and Destruction and Sodom, and they were just totally straight ahead, balls out kind of stuff. And I think Celtic Frost was in that weird coming from where they're from, Switzerland, right? Switzerland, yeah. So I don't necessarily know the metal lineage of Switzerland outside of them, but they seem to be kind of a force on their own. But they're another one of those bands that not really technically flashy at all. It's all really, really stock power chord stuff, but what they could do with it was unbelievable, and it's been a blueprint for 25 years. Absolutely, absolutely. And Anathema will really pick apart some Celtic Frost riffing, especially in this next song that we're going to hear from the Pentecost EP. Mm-hmm. There's quite a bit of that sort of just simplistic riffing that Celtic Frost sort of made their name on. That bands like Napalm Death and Obituary. I mean, everyone is Celtic Frost. Credited with the grind breakdown. Yeah, basically. Absolutely. So so this is kind of interesting. We just wanted to share that female vocal song, even though it's not essentially it's not what Anathema was all about. It's just kind of like bridging a couple songs together. Yeah. I mean, it's just for atmosphere in the record. It's nothing they'd probably pull out live to play or anything. Absolutely. It just sort of adds a different element to the band. I think, again, they're kind of a potpourri type band anyway, so here's another aspect to listen to. But the next record we're going to hear from is Pentacost III. And this one you're, I think, a little bit more familiar with than I am. And it really kind of features, again, kind of a historical, medieval-looking cover. Looks like a kind of a medieval painting of some sort.
Yeah, I can tell you exactly what it is.
You know, just even like the logo, you know, and then the title is like kind of almost an old Latin, kind of Roman numeral-looking language, and very... It just had this older feel, and then, you know, the religious reference of Pentacost III and stuff. But it's an EP, but it's a long player, and only featured 5 songs.
That's a hell of a long player.
Yeah, a couple of songs are you know, inching towards the 10-minute mark, including the one that we're going to hear, "We the Gods," which, you know, both Mark and I agree is sort of the centerpiece of the whole record. But
this it seemed like they got a little bit more focused, but at the same time stretched everything out even more. And it's all about, I don't know if it's as much about it's atmosphere, but everything in this record is about building. Building. Like, it'll take 6 minutes and there's like a huge payoff, and then it kind of teeters back down and then pays off a little bit more toward the end. But this just kind of shows their songwriting, you know, maturing, or actually it's just the epicness of what, this is probably the peak of their epicness, I think.
Yeah.
Before it comes back down a little bit more to a personal level.
Sure, absolutely. I would say, too, you're starting to hear they're learning how to play their instruments better. You're starting to hear a lot more twin leads in this, and especially at the end of the song. It almost kind of gets some Iron Maiden kind of galloping.
A little bit of Manowar going on there, too.
Yeah, it's a really neat song, and it has a lot of different elements working for it. And then we'll sort of play an interesting treat after that. So
everybody's favorites.
Yeah,
we'll talk about that one.
Enjoy "We the Gods" from the Pentacost III EP.
And a secret that we'll tell you later. You just heard We the Gods, and the last slightly different song, might have sounded a little different than everything else we played so far, was Nailed to the Cross 666, which was on the Nailed to the Cross 666 / Eternal Rise of the Sun 7-inch. I think they came out post... I don't know if it came out after this or before it or what the chronologic nature is of the thing, but yeah, that's totally, they played that live I think every time.
Sure.
It's almost like a Misfits sounding song or something.
Yeah, it's not, we're not opening up a strange new realm of satanic anathema or something like that. It's just,
I think it's like the most heavy metal song you can have. Like, that's all the lyrics are is 666.
Yeah, I think they're just kind of, again, poking fun at some of the metal conventions, because they bucked so many kind of metallic conventions and yet considered themselves in the metal genre. But it's a fun song. We just thought we'd kind of throw it out there for people that maybe haven't heard that before. It shows up in some places.
And if you didn't have the that actual 7-inch, it was on the end of the Pentacost III EP. At the very end of Memento Mori, it kind of slows out, and then if you just let the thing go, it'll start kicking after a little while. But.
And you also see some of that stuff show up on the Resonance EPs.
There's actually 3 different EPs, recordings of it.
Yeah,
that I have so far that we kind of discovered today. So.
And we don't know when they recorded it, at what point they recorded, but some kind of differences there. But that's sort of interesting, because this also ends a certain Anathema era, because this is where the vocalist
Darren Waite takes off. I don't know. I don't remember what happened, if he was kicked out, if he left. I think it was.
Well, he something happened as I've spoken with Vincent before, and I kind of talked to him about where his vocal influences sort of come from, and like how he sort of chose to sing differently than Darren. Basically, they were in the studio recording the very next record, which we're going to be talking about, called Silent Enigma, or The Silent Enigma.
The other one we just saw, the Rise of the Pantheon, was that the other?
Yeah, well, it's interesting. In the Pentecost III, falling things here. In the Pentecost III CD case, it said, coming soon, Rise of the Pantheon Dreams. Yeah, and we kind of looked around for it, and I don't know if that was maybe what Silent Enigma was supposed to be called, but it
Did you notice if Darren was credited with any lyrics in this album?
I can't remember, but the story goes, as Mark kind of looks through this, is that in the studio, as they're recording it, something happened, some sort of spat of some sort, and Darren left. And Anathema sort of had to, talk about whether or not they were going to continue as a band, and they all turned to Vincent, who I think had done some backing vocals on a couple of the tracks throughout the years, and they said, hey, you got to sing if we're going to keep this thing together. And so Vincent essentially taught himself how to sing in the studio, which turned out to be maybe a blessing in disguise, I think, for Anathema's career, for their longevity. Not that Darren wasn't great, but I think with the future direction of where they were going to go, I don't think his vocals would have fit into anything that I kind of hear. Yeah. They may have fit on Silent Enigma because the music was still fairly heavy and still epic, I guess. But
and it wasn't that much of a stretch, really, from Darren to Vincent on this record, but
beyond that, because I think he knew he had to get serious as a vocalist after the Silent Enigma, and taking vocal lessons and really studying, the art of singing, because I think these guys knew that this was going to be not a flash in the pan kind of band. If it was, they probably would have walked away as soon as Darren left during the Silent Enigma recording, and maybe said, okay, let's just get this one album done and then see what happens. But again, you can hear it in his vocals that, even though it's amateurish in a way, because he doesn't really know what he's doing, he covers up for his lack of ability with so much sort of torment and emotion.
Oh yeah, a lot of turmoil going on, a lot of anger.
Yeah, and it sort of adds that beautiful element that we've talked about before with the Stooges and Immortal and some of these other bands of maybe sometimes inexperience and lack of sort of perfection makes it even better and more interesting than what it would be, otherwise. It's kind of cool. Like he didn't know what he was doing.
You make out of desperation instead of having so many choices at your fingertips. That you don't necessarily make. I know a lot of. I've met a lot of musicians that are incredibly proficient players, but they cannot write anything to save their life. They can play a billion scales, but ask them to write a song, they can't. But a lot of people that can't play very well
are
come up with great songs.
Yeah, and here you see, I think, a really good balance between the two, starting to really kind of formulate on the Silent Enigma. And Vinny really is going to go take this band to kind of new places. But not just Vinny. I think Danny was writing like music that was more sophisticated, more epic. And again, everybody's sort of upping their game on this record.
Yeah.
And to me, this is the biggest sort of split musically that I think you start to see. Is as great as We the Gods was, it still had some of those more primitive elements that Serenades kind of locked onto, and here they're kind of diving forward into the future. This record was really hard to get a hold of for years, though. You said that was part of the reason you never heard this thing.
Yeah, I think Chris might have had a copy, like a burned copy or like a promo copy, something like that, or even a clear vinyl or something goofy like that. But
I know I'd
never seen the CD since. Is this a reissue here?
I can't remember. I think it originally came out in 95.
Oh, this was 97 on Fierce put it out.
Yeah.
So I think that's the first time I got it was 97, 98, 99, something like that.
Yeah, but I know it originally came out in 94, 95, if I'm not mistaken, because Serenades was 92, Pentacost III was like 94-ish, and then this was, I think, 95. So
I think that's when Peaceville, I don't know if they were dealing with Caroline or who their American distributor was, but
yeah,
it was kaput at that point. So.
And then didn't they link up then with Music for Nations, I think, at that point?
I think so.
Possibly. So, anyways, you don't care about label stuff, I'm sure, out there in listening land. But we're going to hear a pair of songs, and again, they're longer songs. They're both pushing the 8-minute mark. But if you're really paying attention to the compositions of the song, it's not going to get boring or anything. Great headphone songs. I think Anathema is really here. They're about to start to turn into this great band that really you should be listening to them on headphones and closing your eyes and kind of just getting lost in the
12-inch record.
And it kind of begins with this, but a couple of really upbeat tunes, I'd say. We're gonna hear Restless Oblivion, which just has some great lyrics like a bleak garden to cry and loveless so real, lifetime immortality. Again, Anathema was a doom band, and they dealt with these sort of downtrodden kind of elements and,
outside of doom, like an anguish band. Really.
Yeah, exactly.
To it,
this is definitely their anguish record, but we're gonna hear Restless Oblivion, and that kind of a standard for Anathema, kind of like Sleepless was before, and that's A Dying Wish, which when we saw them play, I know they've played both times. I think
that the first time I saw them play, I think that's the first time I ever heard the song.
Oh, is it? Yeah, because
I figured, that's probably on Eternity or Judgment or something.
Yeah.
But no, it's back here. So
cool. So
and that's one of those ones that makes the leap from the more aggressive vocals to the traditional singing flawlessly. I mean, everything's right there.
And I think in particular in A Dying Wish is where you and I both really start to pick up on the primordial sound. There's just even vocally, I think Vincent's sort of anguished vocals sound more like, I can't remember the lead singer Primordial's name.
I can't either. But Spirit Earth of Flame has a very Anathema. It's like, almost if it could have been the album that they did instead of Silent Enigma almost.
Yeah.
But with a little bit more, Krukan-ishness.
Yeah. Exactly. So enjoy the big builds, the driving sort of big builds that you're going to hear here on Anathema.
mortality. Condemned to misery. Restless oblivion forever. A bleak garden to cry. When my inamorato died, a bleak garden to cry. When my inamorato died.
dying embrace, scattered earth, silence.
Welcome back. You just heard A Dying Wish, and right before that, Restless, Oblivion, and that pair of tracks was from the Silent Enigma, the sort of third standard record from Anathema, but I guess technically second full length because they consider Pentacost III a EP. But
do you know if this was reissued when they reissued Serenades by Peaceville?
That's a
if
great.
They did like a digipack version.
I have no idea actually. My hunch says no.
Okay.
I don't know why. Just because I've never seen anything around.
See, I don't know if they did Pentacost III or not, if it's just Serenades reissue, or if there's some kind of legalities to that or what.
Yeah. Yeah, you'd think they would be able to because, again, most of the stuff was still owned by Peaceful because it was all on the Resonance, those two Resonance kind of greatest hits discs that they did a few years back.
And they redid, like they reissued all the Autopsy and Dark Throne. And
yeah, I mean, maybe, again, this seems to be like one of those records that maybe, I don't know if Peaceful like purposely wants it to be hard to find for people or what.
I don't know, it's kind of
frustrating, yeah. Well, then the next area that Anathema is sort of going to go into, as I mentioned, is that Vincent, after this record, really kind of ups his game in terms of singing.
Yeah.
And I'd say he may have been listening to some Jeff Buckley at that time. I don't know if he discovered him before Buckley died or after, but certainly the vocal influence that you really start to hear on this record is David Gilmour and Roger Waters from Pink Floyd. And,
yeah, especially vocal lines and totally sound like
absolutely
something you hear off the wall or
Yep.
or Dark Side or something. So.
And speaking of, Dark Side and The Wall, whereas like I think some of their stuff that came before was almost more fitting with the pre-Dark Side kind of Umaguma, metal, Adam's Heart Mother, kind of like experimental Pink Floyd stuff that was really unstructured. They're starting to build structure, and in fact, like The Wall, they're kind of building a progressive story. Because Eternity, the fourth record, the last record we're going to be looking at, is a story of sort of a man's sort of life journey. And I knew you that was something you hadn't really been aware of.
I'm not a big reader of lyrics.
Yeah. But again, you missed this record the first time around. So it wasn't locked in. I remember really being fascinated by this. I was a junior or senior in high school, and I'd sit down and really try and figure out what the story was here and if there was any greater meaning to what was happening. And
I think I picked up Judgment before I got this, so this seemed like Judgment Light.
Exactly. And this record has some really great tracks on it, but
I think it's very transitional though. Yeah. It's the one I probably put on the least amount of video, but
I would say it has two of my favorite songs from them, which we'll hear. But as a whole, it can be I don't want to say a rough listen because I don't want to discount it, but it's very buried in a lot of kind of keyboard atmospherics, and it's almost too Pink Floyd.
It's got a little too much fat that should have been cut off, I think.
Yeah,
but
and maybe that was the sort of mid-90s excess, before they kind of streamlined their sound.
Yeah,
and they really did on the next record, which we won't really get into this time. But it's a really interesting sort of storyline that follows this sort of life and death and like dealing with the issues of sort of mortality and will I live forever. And there's actually a trio of songs all called Eternity, and again it's dealing with this these sort of universal truths of what happens when we die and where do we go, and coming to the end of your life and not really wanting to be alive anymore and just wanting to get it over with. And it's a pretty heavy record from an intellectual sort of standpoint, and they're going to kind of take those. I think they do themes like this maybe better with like A Fine Day to Exit and A Natural Disaster, which deal with similar kind of elements, which is this sort of like life cycle and dealing with suicide. And
but they seem
like
they seem to bring it more personally. It's not such a broad kind of big idea kind of concept record way. It comes back more to like a pop sensibility or a good rock sensibility.
And you can hear sort of their attempt to make it sound important, and I think that's what sometimes weighs it down at times is like they're adding like all these kind of keyboards and circumstance and pomp a little bit, and not to make it sound like it's a Yes record or anything. It's not. But again, it's just it's a harder record from start to finish unless you really just want to hear the story and follow the story. But if you're just looking to put on an Anathema record, it's, to me, not, like you said, a little bit harder to kind of get into. But we're going to hear kind of a trio of tunes off this, and I think they're kind of the most sort of single like songs on the record. One is The Beloved, and then the second one we'll hear is Far Away. And it's interesting that Far Away, they I can't remember if it was for the 10-year anniversary Peaceville record that they put out. I don't know if you remember that, but I know the song, it's an acoustic version of Far Away that will end up showing up on one of the Resonance CDs, and it's a really cool tune. I know it's on is it the first one, Resonance Part 1, but I can't remember where it originally appeared. I want to say it's this weird like anomaly disc that was a Peaceville 10th anniversary, and on it Anathema also did some covers of Some Velvet Morning, which I can't remember
No, that was My Dying Bride.
Was that My Dying Bride?
Yeah.
But that's the same comp that it was on with the Some Velvet Morning. And,
okay, yeah, because the My Dying Bride Meisterwork has all those tracks too,
Yeah.
but I'm not exactly sure what.
Yeah, and it was this weird 10-year anniversary Peaceville thing. But anyways, it's a really neat song, both acoustically and the version you're going to hear from Eternity here. And then we'll end with the third part of Eternity, which is an appropriate way kind of to end the show because it's sort of
it's kind of a triumphant song instead of like wallowing in,
it's almost like
misery
making it to, it's like whether this person kind of made it to the afterlife of some sort and kind of seeing the light at the end of the tunnel, I guess.
Yeah.
But what are your thoughts on these songs, the three that we have here, which aren't buried so much in the keyboard?
I think, did they play Far Away live at all?
They always play Far Away.
Because there's kind of like a bit of stuff that doesn't need to be there in the beginning of the song, just kind of like rambles on before it really kicks in. But, I mean, these songs, you can see it seems like they've kind of refined these as they've gone on, and they kind of fit more with what they're doing now. But these are like almost like the gestation of the songs. It's not a fully formed song in my mind. But
yeah. And The Beloved really features, I think, a pretty great vocal performance from Vincent. He's really starting to try and clean his sound up a little bit. And he's really pushing his vocals pretty far.
Well, it seems like he's learned how to breathe right, not strain out the back of the throat quite so much, and tense up. And they're not relying on echo and reverb and stuff for his vocals.
And you also hear it on a song which we don't have time to play, but if again, this is hopefully an opportunity for you to want to go and check out some of this stuff. There's a really great Pink Floyd cover that's on this record. It's the centerpiece of the whole album, and it's called Hope, and it's a pretty neat song. And he's really doing the Pink Floyd vocals on that. I mean, he's almost doing the thing where it's in order to sing like that, you almost have to tap your Adam's
it's like
apple.
A vibrato on his voice. But actually in iTunes you can check out some of the clips of Eternity, Natural Disaster, Judgment, and Alternative 4. So
all great records, which most are records we're not dealing with today. But again, Eternity is sort of the start of the new Anathema sound. So and also the original, well, more or less original lineup minus Darren. But
the core musical group.
Exactly.
We'll call it that.
Exactly. So enjoy a trio from Eternity from Anathema.
close my eyes, my mind becomes clear. Still I dream temptation. One life, another day. A vestal child, unveiled by temptation. Innocence slips away. Far away.
hopefully you enjoyed the Eternity Trio we just played there. Hopefully end on a positive, sort of life-affirming note. Any final thoughts on Anathema's early era?
Pre song or song set here. We thought there was only a couple albums available on iTunes, but for all those people that don't like buying CDs anymore, you get the whole back catalog on iTunes now, like $10 a pop. So,
and you can also find an added, a kind of neat little Anathema bonus if you find the
you're a Slayer fan.
And a Slayer fan. They did a really neat cover of "Read Between the Lies" on the Slaytanic Slaughter discs that were put out,
which is about like 80% good, actually.
Yeah,
it's got a pretty good
it's
lineup.
got a couple clunkers on there, but some neat stuff. Like Unanimated's on there, and Seance, Edusanity, Enslaved, At the Gates, Dissection, Hypocrisy, Cradle of Filth, Vader. Yeah, even that Cradle of Filth, Hell Awaits tune is sort of interesting. It's a different approach. I don't know. I know Slayer was really like kind of beefed about it.
This sounds like crap.
Which is interesting because I think that was like in the mid '90s when they didn't know what this black metal kind of thing was, and I'm sure like Slayer would be like, yeah, we're cool with it now. But anyways, we're not talking about Slayer. Again, maybe down the road we'll get into the different, the other era of Anathema, but we're not kind of intending this as any kind of 2-part show or anything. But
this is just kind of Anathema the early years.
Yeah, is all we're sort of looking for. So, again, if you have any feedback on this sort of stuff, because I know the last couple episodes, this one and Paradise Lost, maybe we're a little bit different from where we had been before, which was a little more sort of brutal and confrontational in ways, but we're hoping to open the show up to some different kinds of sounds.
It's kind of funny, we're trying to change format, but then we end up doing 2 British doom bands from the same time.
Exactly.
But it's kind of a neat thing to be able to see where, at same time period where 2 bands started, where they kind of ended up to some degree. We didn't show the whole back catalogs by any means, but maybe we'll get a My Dying Bride show on here at some point.
Yeah, that's
true. Show the third tier and then get a Cathedral as well.
And I can definitely see those sort of coming down the road. But so again, if you have any kind of feedbacks or comments, please email us at requiempodcast@gmail.com. That's REQUIEM podcast at gmail.com. So until next time, this is Jason
and Mark.
God speaks through you. Your rest is not full of lies, gains popularity. You can't afford the old and suffer when empty pockets cry from hunger. Penniless from the generosity, sharing the money to quench your greed. Searching for the answers to their prayers. They call out one last wish of need. Save me! Lives and breathes in me. The Almighty transformed to your screen. The meaning's lost in its translation. No holy words describe his deception. You say you'll help us find the Lord. Tell me, preacher, how do you know? A simple quest for a visible Savior to lead us through our final prayer. Save me! Nations contribute to the cause. Luxury's your righteous reward. Praise the Lord, praise God is what you wish to sound. There is no heaven without a hell. Truly believe that by giving you can save your soul. Could you be so naive? You heal the sick, you raise the dead, you bind a congregation with the things you say. Religious blackmail and deceit on trust. The death will come and all will be lost. and knows his deceiving eyes. Ignore the writing on the wall. He should read between the lines. When Tom decides his honesty, an inquiry, is it blasphemy? If you're the soul that's made to suffer, the soul is meant to hide or cover. An empty promise lie unfulfilled. Still a dream of getting killed. They claim a trip to hell is nearby. You may believe it, but Satan wouldn't lie.